So now that we're entering our next section on totalitarianism and World War II, we're going to first lay the foundation of what were these totalitarian governments. We're going to look at their principles, the qualities and characteristics, and then we're going to jump into Stalin as our example of our first totalitarian regime. Okay, so as a reminder, as this roadmap kind of gives us an understanding of what happens in Europe in the 20th century in the first half, okay, these are the major transformative events. We start off with World War I and the Russian Revolution, and just because of the devastation, the outcome of it allows and causes Europe to go through that period called the Age of Anxiety, the interwar period. And between the wars, we can see that there is a lot of instability that goes on, disillusionment, and eventually people are going to be accepting these totalitarian governments as they come on the rise in the 1920s and 30s, going and leading into World War II. Okay, on your handout, you also have this chart. The chart is a kind of a good, I guess, organized way to look at a compare contrast between these two types of totalitarian governments. Okay, so just to clarify, both fascism and communism are going to be used for totalitarian regimes. However, their values are much different if you compare and contrast them through this chart, right? The values are different. Oftentimes, how the dictators will carry out their governments are going to be very same because of the types of methods they use. Okay, so certain values are different and some are the same. Okay, so just have this as a resource in mind. It's better than me just explaining it in detail, but you can study this, and if you have any questions, just ask me in class. All right, really quickly, I do want to introduce these two concepts with clarity. Okay, so the two concepts are conservative authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Now, the question for last year's FRQ, or at least 2013's FRQ, was to analyze the factors that led to the rise of right-wing authoritarian regimes in continental Europe in the interwar period, 1919 to 1939, the interwar period. Okay, so you can pause me and rewind that real quick, but that was last year's selection, one of the selections that you could have written on, and many students did. They felt like this was some of the easier one, and this is going to talk about some of those factors, and also leading into the next lecture as well. Okay, so one thing I just want to lay down is between this Venn diagram is that the theme is dictatorship. Okay, so dictatorship is going to be a common ground between the two, but dictatorship is not new to Europe. We talked about how the 20th century dictators are much different from absolute monarchs, and when we get there, right, we'll talk about how they're different, right? So now we're here, and now we're going to talk about it. So conservative authoritarianism is conservative in the sense of traditional, okay, not open to change, okay, so it's not necessarily, oh, you're more of conservative liberally or politically and that type of thing, right? It's not the spectrum, but just that conservatives are not willing to change. They're just going to keep things the way they are. So traditionally, they're going to be anti-democratic, anti-republic, right? They don't want voting. They don't want people's rights to be chosen and elected, right? So, for example, your absolute monarchs, Louis XIV, Peter the Great, Frederick the Great, Metternich even, right? They are conservative authoritarian. They believe in having centralization of power through one ruler, okay? And that ruler will call the shots. So what makes them distinct is that these types of, what do you call them, kingdoms, dynasties, or monarchies, these regimes, these governments wanted to prevent any changes from changing the existing social order, the social classes, right? How society is laid out, they don't want to change that. They're okay with keeping it as it is, right? So their power of how they came to power and established power is from a traditional dynasty, right? So the monarch being at the top and the head, having all the power, the son gets it, right, inherits the throne, right? That's traditional. That's just kind of how it is. They don't change the status quo. Many times the aristocracy is working closely, right, with the royalty and nobility, and so that's kind of how the power has always been structured, right? So they don't want to mess with that. People, regular citizens, just kind of went about their lives, and they didn't really care so much always what's happening on a national scale. They're just caring about what's happening in their local town, their city. Okay, they didn't always have ties of this whole, nation state. Also, another factor of what distinguishes conservative authoritarianism to totalitarianism is that there are a lot of barriers. Okay, there's geographical barriers that they couldn't always get around. They kept their own affairs kind of isolated, whether it's locally or kind of in a county, right, or even just in your state, geographical barriers. And also, there's a lot of customs, right, and cultures that is hard to kind of overcome, right. However, when we get to the totalitarian dictatorships in the 20th century, that will change. Okay, so popular participation in government was not allowed in the age of conservative authoritarianism. It was not the participation of the masses that really led to that type of government, right? It was just the central ruler calling that type of rule, okay, or laws. All right, so these types of governments are going to revive after World War I. And especially, we're going to look at Eastern Europe. If you guys remember, at the end of World War I, a lot of those new countries were formed, right? They had their own nation states, like Lithuania, Finland, Estonia, Latvia. Okay, Eastern Europe along the West Russian border, and they had their own democracies for a period of time. But because of the Great Depression and because of the instability that went on, those democracies quickly crumbled, and they reverted back to what we call conservative authoritarian governments. Okay, only Czechoslovakia in Eastern Europe remained democratic. The rest all returned back to a form of dictatorship, not necessarily completely totalitarianism, but more of the conservative authoritarian. Okay. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about totalitarianism. In the 20th century, it's very different because you have the participation of the masses. And what we're going to see is that because of the age of mass politics from 1870 to 1914, right, a lot of these participations and intellectual trends, new ideas, fueled these irrational ideologies, and people began to accept, right, whatever these dictators were beginning to shout out and stuff. Okay, so by participating and having the ability to participate in the government, right, they are kind of the ones that are supporting these types of totalitarian governments. And why would they? Okay, why would they? Well, if we look at where they came from contextually, they came from the time of age of anxiety. They came from a time where devastating losses, right? Detriment was rampant. Destruction was all around them, and hopelessness and disillusionment was all they knew, right? And constantly they feel that their current government is failing them, and they needed change. And so they themselves would welcome in these types of promises in their lives given by the dictators. And adding on to that, we're going to look at how the age of realpolitik and mass politics, kind of like the new political developments, has kind of led to where they are today. Okay, so you guys kind of remember, right? There's the growth of anti-Semitism throughout this time, right? There's a rise of anarchy and anarchy supporting violence. Okay, so just accepting this concept, even, right? The immense nationalism that was growing through the age of imperialism and going into World War I, right? Crazy nationalism, right? And that's going to be, all these are going to be qualities that are now part of government and just kind of accepted. Okay, social Darwinism, right? This intellectual thought that dominating the weaker race or ethnicity is acceptable because, right, the survival of the fittest. Okay, and even just the employment of propaganda, even during this time, is widely accepted, and people are normally used to it, right? So all these qualities are part of what we call a totalitarian government, but it's because they've really incepted themselves over time throughout the age of mass politics, going into imperialism, World War I, and now here we are, where I guess the most benefiting factor, one of the most benefiting factors, was the use of mass media. Okay, technology was at the fingertips of these new governments and these new dictators, and they used them to their advantage and exploited them, right? So radio, okay, radio broadcasts, the use of automobiles and just transportation, being able to go and visit and transport whatever they need to do all over the country. The use of telephone, right? And so governments could, wiretap telephone lines and spy on any, suspects that they feel that are opposing their rule, right? Improved communication allows them to coordinate quickly with local officials and telling them what to do instead of like sending them a letter. Okay, radio is used, to have propaganda broadcasts and speeches, right? Versus constantly needing to print out newspapers and have them read them, okay, or magazines or whatever, okay. And so using these types of methods, they were able to disseminate the information and reach kind of the populace more quickly. And some other tools that are characteristic of dictatorships that are going to be amplified in totalitarian governments are censorship. Got to know these, okay? Censorship, indoctrination, and terror. Okay, this is going to be a very common thing, and we're going to see them each in the Soviet Union, each in Italy, and Nazi Germany. So you got to remember these. So when they ask about like the factors to right-wing governments, you're going to say, okay, some of the tools and methodologies used are going to be censorship, indoctrination, terror. Got to drop those. Okay, so censorship, very quickly. We know that the government will censor any information that is opposing them, and they're going to promote anything that is supporting, or even fictitiously make up any types of news as they would, right? So the media is basically at the hands of the government. It's a tool for them to manipulate whatever they want, manipulate truth. Okay, indoctrination, right? To be taught and to learn to the point where it's automatically accepted, right? You're being brainwashed. It's through the education system. Okay, education was creating loyal citizens, kind of as like a machine, right? It's kind of like a factory churning out these faithful citizens, and they're going to be talking about how like Nazis, Germany's enemies are communists and Jews, and these are the evil demons that have ruined our country, right? It's their fault. They are the scapegoats, right? We just put the blame on them, right? And so that's going to be one way, and we're going to start them off young. Indoctrination should begin early. It should be consistent. It should be frequent, okay, in order to really get the really incepted into the minds of the people, right? Also, terror, right? By using physical force, by instilling fear into the people's lives, they are going to obey and not revolt. Because the fear of punishment, the fear of being thrown in jail, the fear of execution, and so that was oftentimes the policy of the government, that they're willing to terrorize their own citizens in order to get what they want. Okay, all right. So with this chart, hope you filled it out. You got to know this going into the AP test, that they're very same in the sense that they're both dictatorships. They both have underlying qualities of, authoritarian rule. However, totalitarianism is definitely the next step to it. Okay. All right. So let's go into the Soviet Union just really quickly, and just seeing the progress of the Soviet Union after its time of the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay. So just as a reminder, Lenin, being the main leader, he was following a Marxist ideology, accepting Karl Marx's idea that there would be a revolution through the working class. However, he also predicted or accepted that it's not going to be just in the hands of the working class because they're not educated, right? So Lenin's view is going to be a step further, in contrast to Marx, where he envisioned that the elite intellectuals are going to be the ones that are going to be leading the way. Proletariat are kind of the muscle and the force helping through, and together they're going to have a worldwide communist movement, right? And so countries around the world are going to be seeking for communism because people desire for change, people desire for equality. Okay. All right. So at the end of the Russian Civil War, when the communists and nationalists were fighting, okay. the Bolsheviks or the communists instituted war communism, right? And so just as a recap, the purpose was that in order to win the Russian Civil War, right, and to defeat the nationalists, the communists created their own type of economic system that basically was socialization of everything. Okay, so to nationalize everything, all industries are going to be under the control of a central planning committee, right? So the government is that central planning authority. They plan how all production will be, how the entire economy will be, and that is a taste of war communism. And I was just focused on the war, okay? What actually happened, though, is that even though they pursued where the government would have that central planning authority, the Bolsheviks really kind of messed the economy up because they didn't really know how to allocate, right, its industries and its resources efficiently, because it's all under one general committee that's doing it under Lenin's oversight. And so what we're going to see is, there's different sectors. You have your industrial sector, you have your agricultural sector, right, you have financial sector, banks and stuff. At that point, right, it's not planned well, it's not coordinated well, and so you're going to see that there's going to be mass starvation because of crop failures and unable to distribute grains and crops efficiently, right? Industrial output is also going to decline, and so it's going to show that it's going to be very weak as a planning system. Okay, so what will happen is that Lenin will have to create a new type of system to save the Russian economy. Okay, so it's called the NEP, the New Economic Policy, and this is going to last from 1921 to 1928. And at this point, it's really kind of refining the economy where it's not completely nationalized, not completely just under a socialist type of economic system, but to allow some capitalist measures. Okay, so Lenin realizes that peasants are revolting. The military got destroyed in World War I, and their economy is in ruin. So in order to save it, he says this is a necessary step backwards, right? In order to go forward, we got to take a couple steps back. Okay, and so what the government decided to do under Lenin was that they're not going to control, especially the agricultural sector, completely, and they're not going to take all the grains from the peasants, but the peasants can sell some grains for themselves, and they kind of have a free market temporarily, right? Some small manufacturers, some workshops and factories are allowed to run their businesses freely without being controlled. This is your output. This is what you need to make. So giving some freedom, right? Let the people do what they want, laissez-faire. The government allows some of the small businesses to happen, some private ownership. However, the government still controlled all the heavy industry. Talking about heavy industry, heavy manufacturing, right? That's creating machines. The banks and the railroads were still, transportation was still controlled by the government. But in the end, the NEP actually improved the Russian economy. So this saved Lenin's kind of face in terms of how he was running the economy. Now, does it look hypocritical? Yes, it is. But like he said, it's a necessary step to go backwards in order to go forward. And finally, industry and agricultural production is going to kind of come back to its pre-World War I levels. And workers are going to have better conditions to some extent, right? And Lenin's impact on society is going to transform because of his NEP partially. Okay, so under Lenin, he's going to abolish the old social structure, right? So there's no longer any nobilities. It's just we are just one people, right? A class of society. That's what socialism is, right? He also is going to support women in theory by saying that they are just classes as well, right? We're just equal. We're all workers. Okay, and so Russians had a greater expectation of freedom, and they felt that they are more liberated under Lenin than they were under the Tsar. They felt that, and this is partially propaganda too, right? That they basically could pursue what they wanted to. Under the Tsar, they were withheld that freedom, and there's less of an influence towards the Greek Orthodox Church, partially because, remember, the Tsar is seen as like the father, and so with no more Tsar, they kind of want to just go to a more non-religious route. Later, when Stalin comes in, this is going to be completely changing, where those freedoms are going to be quickly gone. Okay, all right. So Lenin's going to die. He's going to get sick, and then he's going to die in 1924. Lenin did not clearly choose who the successor will be, so it's going to be between his right-hand man Trotsky and Stalin. Differences between Trotsky and Stalin is that Trotsky believed that the revolution was an ongoing thing, that the world will follow to a communist revolution as well. This is in line with Lenin. However, between what Lenin and Stalin wanted, it would come down to who will fight for it, and Stalin will manipulate his way. Okay. Now, Stalin, he believed in having in establishing Russia and the Soviet Union to be completely socialist first before it can entertain any outside affairs of communist revolutions outside of their own country. Right. So, Russia has to be strong internally, and its efforts of international politics should be disregarded for temporarily in order for it to be stable first, right? So establishing a strong socialist economy without dependency upon any Western influence was Stalin's goal, okay? So Stalin is going to gain effective control in 1927. It's going to be under his rule because he basically used his position as general secretary to appoint officials, and then by bribing them, he gained support in the Communist Party, and eventually he made Trotsky look like a traitor and made him be the one that was going to be selected as the next leader of the Soviet Union, right? So it's very manipulative, okay? All right, as you can see, right, in this meme down in the left-hand corner, Trotsky doesn't like me. Ice pick time. Trotsky was exiled and eventually from the Soviet Union. Eventually he's going to be in Mexico, and Stalin will send an agent and assassinate him, and they will kill him with an ice pick into his skull. Okay. All right. So now that the Soviet Union is under Stalin, right, this is where Stalin begins to purge all of the Communist Party that were not loyal to him. Okay. So first order of business is that Stalin says that we need to create a 5-year plan, which means that we are going to focus on industrializing our country. Okay, Stalin says that we are 50 or 100 years behind the other advanced countries, meaning Western Europe and the United States. We must make a good effort in reaching industrialization within this 5 to 10 years, because if we don't, we will surely die. Okay, so he believes that the Soviet Union is so far behind, and it's recognized so in World War I, right, that if he does not push the country, they're done for. Okay, so the objectives are: we're going to increase industrial output in the 5-year plans, right? So let's increase industrialization by 250%. Let's increase our steel making by 300%. Let's increase our agricultural production by 150%, which means that the centralization of the economy is once again planned by the government, and this is going to end Lenin's NEP. Okay, and so the results of it is, hey, you know what? They have begun to increase production immensely. Right, steel is going to go up 400%. Soviet Union is going to be one of the largest steel producers in Europe because of this. They're going to produce more oil, much more too. Soviet Union is going to go through a period of urbanization, where we're going to see 25 million people moving to cities, and so the quality of goods, though, is being created. Right, the quality of goods in quantity is a lot, but the quality compared to what was manufactured in the West is going to be subpar. Okay, standard of living is also not going to be as good as well. Okay, so it's a problem, right? The 5-year plans, in a sense, did produce more, but the quality of it is not as good. But even still, the Soviet Union will remain to use it, and we're going to see that the items and products, especially consumer products, are not going to be up to par at all. So the next part of funding the 5-year plans is going to be coming through agriculture. Okay, so Stalin's going to introduce the plan of collectivization. Collectivization was basically for the agricultural peasants to farm, harvest, and then the government collects all the grain, right? And that's why they call it collectivization. This is going to be the way that we're going to fund the 5-year plans, because the Soviet Union government doesn't really have any capital, right? They don't really have an international economy of trading between the other nations at all, right? So they're pretty much self-dependent, and so their agriculture, specifically in Ukraine, is where they're going to focus on making some money. Okay, so collectivization is going to allow Stalin to take over the peasantry, right? They're going to be completely controlled, and they're going to start instituting the use of machines in farm production, right? And this is going to cause socialism to rule the countryside once again. And so a bunch of individual peasant farms, right, are going to be revamped and collected into what we call a communal farm. And this is now going to be state controlled, right? So what was individually a privately owned peasant farm, that was called a kulak, Kulak, a kulak. And these kulak peasants had their own farms, they had their own grain, they kind of, under the NEP, they kind of had their own living. But now Stalin says, no, you just work for us, we just pay you some, and you get some grain if we allow you to, right? So eventually the state can now take the grain and feed it mainly to the factory workers, and a lot of peasants are upset, right? So because these kulaks, these wealthy peasants, were upset, they are going to resist collectivization, and so Stalin obviously does not take opposition lightly, and so he says, you know what, we're going to liquidate them, or we're just going to kill them all, right? And so we're going to see 10 million peasants are going to die from collectivization, and 7 million of them are going to die mainly from starvation, right? That Stalin and the government are basically either going to just kill them off instantaneously, or just take all grain away from them, and at that point, they have nothing to eat. Okay. Okay. So collectivization, in a sense, didn't really work. Okay. Yes, it was the plan by the central authority, command economy. However, it was ineffective overall to increase agricultural production. Okay. All right. Propaganda is going to be widely used, as you can see in this example. Propaganda. The purpose was to glorify Stalin and his plans, and how the Soviet people are encouraged to work together to increase productivity. The working class is hardworking and supportive, no matter like what industry they're part of. And it's Stalin that's going to lead the Soviet Union into its next stage of glory. And so technology, propaganda posters, newspapers, films, radio, all these are going to be used for promoting socialism and talking down on destroying capitalism. Okay, religion is also going to be destroyed under Stalin. Orthodox churches and priests are going to be executed, and so he wants to turn churches that were once places of worship into museums of atheism, and that every type of decor that was religious would be removed from the homes of people, and instead they're going to put up portraits of Stalin. Okay, all right. Women's rights. Very quickly, women's rights. They're gonna be proclaiming that it's equality of women. However, that's not really true. Okay, so the women, we're urged to work and be part of the working class and being productive. Right, women are still expected to do household things, to be domestic, because that was more of a feminine role, right? That was more of what the woman's responsibility is. Men would continue just to do jobs that were more higher in rank and seen as better. Okay. All right. So last few things. The Great Terror. These are the few years where terror was used increasingly to control the Communist Party, especially even leaders. And so for no reason, Stalin would draft up lists, and he would arrest people, he would execute people. During this time period of 4 years, the Great Terror would result in millions of arrests, and many were executed. About 1 million people were executed because of Stalin just felt them suspicious and did not like them. Right. So this is where Stalin would say, "Oh, well, you're against the Communist Party. We're going to choose you, and we're going to kick you out." Okay. All right. And in the end, by the late 1930s, we're going to see a lot of the original Bolsheviks, those that followed closely to Lenin. Stalin will get rid of them, and we call the purges, right? Purges, basically, he'll expel and execute many of these faithful Bolshevik leaders, and even any citizens that would talk against the government, they would be killed off too, or they'd be sent to prison camps, labor camps called gulags, and eventually out in Siberia they would be executed.